Okay, thanks for joining us for part 2 of our webinar on opening back up the workforce. And I'm joined today with my partners, Charlie Plumb and Kirk Turner. We're going to talk about the employment considerations related to bringing employees back to work. So, Charlie, tell us about what kind of questions you've been getting and what things people should be thinking about.
Well, thanks, Brandon. Not surprisingly, the conversations have turned to returning to work and employers resuming their operations. That's been triggered by recent releases by the federal government and some comments by our own governor. And it's got companies like our listeners thinking about, how do I go about resuming operations, and how do I go about returning my workforce to work? And what's becoming very apparent as we are working with employers on this subject, planning is going to be key. Planning is absolutely priceless. It's got to be detailed, and we're realizing very quickly that this is not a one-size-fits-all. Your employer planning to resume operations and return people to work is going to be unique in many ways, depending on your workforce, depending on your industry. So one size is not going to fit all. We also need to realize, one thing we've certainly learned throughout this whole process is things evolve, things change. So when we're working with employers now to help them navigate resuming operations and bringing people to work, one of the things we're building into our plans and our discussions with employers is the very important need to maintain flexibility, because one thing you can bet on, Brandon, in this instance is we're going to have changes. We're going to see changes. So that whole planning process, we have to keep flexible. We have to keep nimble, because we're going to be making changes. And we work with employers to build in those kind of modifications, the ability to roll with things as they change. The other challenge that really comes into play here when we're working with employers is you have really 3 categories that become important when you're an employer and you're planning on, how do I get back to work? How do I bring people back to work? First of all, you've got the health or medical side, and that's obviously of critical importance. None of this works unless we do things responsibly from a health and medical standpoint. And we're getting advice and recommendations from the CDC. We're getting some from state and local health authorities. That's obviously high quality advice, but also, as we're going to talk today, not only are you making better decisions when you're an employer relying upon that advice, but most of our laws, we think, are going to insulate you as an employer if you follow those recommendations, those best practices by the CDC and our state and local health departments. You're going to be protected against many legal claims or some accusation by employer employees that you've acted unreasonably or irresponsibly. So that's going to be important. The next factor that comes into play is we're dealing with these stay-at-home orders, some from the federal government, some from the state government, some from our local governments. And they're all talking now about rolling these back or relaxing them. We don't know what that's going to look like right now. We don't know when it's going to occur, so we've got to keep our eye on that when we're working with employers on resuming operations. That's something we're taking into account and monitoring very closely. And one thing we're telling employers right now is it's not going to be necessarily that clear, even as to these stay-at-home orders or quarantine directives by governmental agencies, because we shouldn't be surprised that there may be some inconsistencies down the road. What the federal government says, what the state government says, or what a local government says when it comes to bringing back our workplace and our workforce. They may have different guidelines. They may have different timelines. So we have to keep those in mind. That's something else we're watching. And finally, the third subject that's near and dear to our hearts when we're working with employers that are talking about resuming operations and bringing employees back are the employment laws. The employment laws that really become an issue when we're talking about bringing employees back. We're dealing with health issues. We're dealing with employees' concerns about safety, whether it's safe to return to work. So Kirk, can you walk our listeners through what you see as some of those major employment laws we're going to be considering and they need to consider as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we got a number of laws that we've got to navigate. We've got to kind of work through these issues, as in each individual situation is going to be different. You're not going to have a one size fits all process. This is a different world than we've lived in. We talk about consistency and we talk about sort of consistent application. In my opinion, you're going to be dealing with situations on a one-on-one basis, and every situation is going to be unique. So we want to be, again, flexible in the way we deal with return to work issues. The first thing we need to think about is the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we've all known for a long time that health information is confidential, that we need to maintain it in a confidential way, that we need to separate confidential medical information from other types of personnel related information. But we're also going to be talking to employees about, and people who are returning about their health condition. Have they had symptoms? We're going to test them. We're going to do temperature checks. And we've got clients that are already starting the process of filling out questionnaires and having questioning employees about where have you traveled in the last 2 weeks? Have you had a temperature in the last 72 hours? Those are things that we think that the ADA is going to authorize because the EEOC has given us some flexibility in that regard. Also, the Rehabilitation Act, which is also a federal law, also addresses the questions that might come up. We want to make sure that we're compliant with both of those. The EEOC guidance they've just issued some new guidance. In fact, one of our colleagues, Paige Good, has just written an article on this that's on our COVID-19 response page. So you want to check that out and make sure you look at the guidance that's being provided. We also want to be mindful of the FFCRA, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which, we've been talking about that. We've been making sure that people understand what's implicated. That law is in effect today, and it will continue until at least December 31st of 2020. So if you have an employee that gets sick or is sick now, then you may have a paid sick leave obligation, or if they have the need to be off to care for a child because of child care or school closing, then those laws are still in play. We still need to be compliant with those laws. I would encourage you to, if you don't have an FFCRA policy or you haven't developed forms for employees to complete so that you're documenting the reasons why people are missing work, we would encourage you to do that. Certainly OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, we have a duty, and we've always had a duty to provide a workplace free from known hazards. And so, your safety and health people and your human resource people are vital in making sure that we have a safe and healthy workplace. And we also understand that there could be claims that employees are being retaliated against because they make complaints about health conditions or they're scared to return to work. So we want to ensure that we are communicating with our employees. We think transparency and telling employees what we're doing all the time to try to make our workplaces safe and as healthy as possible. We're following the CDC guidelines. We're communicating with local authorities like Charlie was talking about. We're following the orders that are being issued by our governments. We're doing everything within the range that we possibly can to ensure your safety and health. And then lastly, the National Labor Relations Act. We talked a lot about the NLRA when it comes to unionized workplaces, but today the National Labor Relations Board is very much involved in non-union workplaces. And one of the ways they are involved is because they enforce this law as it relates to what we call concerted activity. That means two or more employees are gathering together to talk about wages or benefits or other terms or conditions of employment, including safety. So we want to make sure that if employees are banding together or they're trying to develop a committee or they're doing something to try to address health issues, that we can't retaliate against them because they engage in that behavior, and they certainly have some protected rights as it relates to communications under the National Labor Relations Act.
Kirk, I think one of the things I've run into when I'm talking to employers, and we're walking through the pitfalls, the who, what, when, and why about returning people to the workplace, it may come down most frequently with an employee expressing some concerns about whether they're willing or ready themselves to come back because they have some concern about the safety of the workplace themselves. So I think your point on both OSHA and the National Labor Relations Act and the Family First Act is a good one. That's where you as employers are going to see many of these issues teed up. So let's kind of start walking this path for those of you that are starting to think, and you should be starting to think, what does this look like in terms of me resuming operations and me bringing workers back to the workplace? And I think it starts with deciding who is that, who is going to come back, and really what we think makes the most sense is look at it from a function or operation standpoint. In other words, when you're trying to plan how this reopening occurs, and it's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen 100% day one, start looking at particular parts of your business, operations, departments, functions, and make decisions about who and when employees are going to be coming back based on what functions and operations you're staging. And I said staging. Dr. Milford made some very good points, I think, on this at the front end of this return to work. We've got a lot of options for employers. We're working with employers that say, look, I know I can't come back 100%, so I'm going to stage this. And here's what makes sense for me for getting my office up and running, or for getting my factory up and running, or getting my retail operation up and running. Another option for employers that's being used and considered by companies are maybe I can bring more employees back, but have them on reduced work schedules. People working 20 hours a week rather than 40 hours. Maybe I can bring back twice as many people. Dr. Milford mentioned the advantages from a health standpoint of staggered shifts or staggered work assignments. It also may assist you from an economic or operational standpoint to stage your return to work and get people re-engaged in active employment if maybe you're not bringing people back at 40 hours apiece, but 20 hours apiece. Keep in mind, when we get into this return to work mode, we're already seeing the value, both practically and from a health standpoint, of remote work or teleworking. And that doesn't go out the window necessarily. In this transition process where we are bringing people back and slowly reopening and following those CDC requirements that Kirk mentioned, let's keep in mind that we should have some ongoing remote or teleworking availability and options. It doesn't shut off automatically. And when you're selecting individual employees, again, I think, Kirk, what makes the most point, or the best point, is select it by function, select it by operation. And we understand when we're working with you as employers, we understand this is going to be a rolling process. Dr. Milford mentioned the workplace of tomorrow is going to look differently. And guess what? Tomorrow's here now. Kirk, what sort of changes to the workplace, actually physical workplace and assignments, are you seeing when you work with employers that are resuming or planning the resumption of operations?
Yeah, I would say the only thing I would add to what you said is if we're going to do teleworking, we need to be clear about what the limitations are of that, how that's going to work from a policy standpoint, that it's intended to be temporary, that we can change that at any time, that we're clear about compensation. When are they working? When are they not working? We just want to be really clear. And we think drafting a telework policy or a telework agreement with particular employees is a really good idea. So let me just give you some thoughts on some things that you want to be thinking about as it relates to changes in this workplace that we're going to see. First of all, we've got to talk about PPE, personal protective equipment. We need to make sure that we have whatever we think is appropriate in our particular work environment relative to personal protective equipment. Do we need masks? Are we going to require people to wear a mask, at least in the initial phases, at least in the phase one? Are they going to be wearing a mask? Are they going to have a face shield of some kind? Are they coming into contact with other employees that might expose them to the virus? Do we have gloves, and are those disposable gloves? Are they available, and how are we going to clean them and to ensure that they're safe? Obviously, we've all washed our hands a lot more than we ever have. And so we want to make sure that we are continuing those really good practices of washing our hands and having sanitizer around. And I just don't think you can overdo that. I don't think and Dr. Milford talked about it staying on surfaces. I don't think we can over clean. I don't think we can overwash our hands. So we want to make sure that we're doing those things and that we're communicating with our employees the responsibility to do that. We've all been in restaurants and restrooms in a restaurant where it says employees must wash their hands. We should just have that in every location where there's a hand wash, that we need to continue to have good hand washing discipline. We want to put in place enhanced or deep cleaning. We need to go in and deep clean our facilities more than we do. And again, you may have people who come in in the evening that clean. We need to, 2 times a week or once a week, come in and deep clean the facility and make sure we're doing more than we normally do, because we want to disinfect this place, and we want to make sure we've addressed surfaces, we've addressed computers, we've addressed things that people are handling all the time to ensure that we have as clean a products as we can that we're touching. And I do think Dr. Milford makes a great point about the virus staying on surfaces. And so I think the way we handle mail needs to be different. I think we need to think about the way we receive product, shipping and receiving, and how we're going to quarantine that product, or how we're going to disinfect it if it's plastic or if it's cardboard. We just need to think about that and have our process be part of that disinfection. We need to limit non-employee access, and we've been doing that. We've been doing a great job of that, having more Zoom meetings, having more remote meetings, and it's okay. It's not perfect. It's not as good as having somebody sitting across the desk, but it's better in many regards because we're taking advantage of this social distancing opportunity. So I would just encourage you to continue to limit access to visitors and customers and businesses unless it's just absolutely necessary. And then I think we got to be thinking about reducing in-person meetings. We don't need to have 10 person. We may have to have 2 different meetings with 4 or 5 people in those meetings. And maybe we do it again remotely. And then we got to be thinking about travel, again, whether it's domestic or international. And at some point we're going to continue to expand, but at least in the initial phases, we should have some limitations on those. And our travel policies need to be clear about what people need to do in terms of getting permission and where they're going to travel. We just need some transparency around that. And then I think, Charlie, we just need to adjust our workplace to promote social distancing. And some of the things that you might think about are, like Charlie said, staggering our work hours and multiple shifts reduces the number of employees that are going to be present at any one time. I love the A-B shift. We work with a number of car dealerships, and they have gone to essentially modified alternate schedules where one team works Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the other team works Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and then they flip it each week to make sure that we're doing it fairly and consistently. I think you need to think about, especially if you're in a manufacturing environment or you're in an assembly processing environment, like food processing, we need to be thinking about distancing, not as close together, may have to move equipment around to ensure that we have more space. Adding physical barriers instead of having, again, it's kind of been the culture to have more open environments where people can kind of work together collectively. I think this particular situation causes us to say we need more cubicles. We need more division of people so they're not going to be exposed to others. And then I think you're going to have to think about, at least for a while, eliminating or repurposing communal activities, whether it's kitchens and conference rooms and other big meeting places. We're going to have to kind of cut that back and maybe use those for different things instead of 20 people getting together for a luncheon.
Yeah, I think in recent years there's been a real move towards open workspace without walls, and really to facilitate more collaboration. I think we'll probably see, unfortunately, maybe a loss of that, a little bit, a necessary and wise loss, but we're going to have probably see an end to these large open work areas that have become popular and prevalent in recent years.
Well, and maybe not forever though, right? I mean,
Correct.
it might be 2 years from now where we've got a vaccine, we feel more comfortable, and we could move back. But I think initially you're right. I think initially we're not going to be in a place where everybody's going to feel comfortable being in a conference room with 25 people.
Yeah, and personally, let me give you a tip about personal hygiene. This weekend, my wife and I gave myself a haircut, and I just want to encourage everybody, be brave. Now's the time to be brave, even when it comes to hair care, okay? So now we're going to bring employees back, and that can't happen without employers thinking about and planning, how do I screen employees? How the people now I've selected by virtue of my staged return to work and what operations and functions they perform, I've now figured out who those folks are. I've asked them to come back to work, but how do I find out whether they're safe to come back to work, whether they're either COVID negative or ideally would have the antibodies? And this is going to be a struggle because we are experiencing a shortage of tests, and that's going to drive this. But a lot of the employers we're dealing with right now are figuring in a testing process, a way to screen incoming employees to make sure they're safe to return to work. We're not being shy. Years ago, as Kirk said, we've been very conservative and very careful, as we should be, on delving into people's health conditions or medical conditions, or maybe the medical or health conditions of their family members, the people they live with. To me, from a practical standpoint, that goes by the boards now. Again, the recommendations and the guidances we're now seeing from the CDC, the Department of Labor, and the EEOC are giving employers a much freer hand, as is reasonable and as is necessary, I think, to be asking employees about their symptoms, to be asking employees about their medical conditions, if they're with anybody that has experienced any symptoms. And as part of this process, we're working with employers to put very specific questionnaires together for employers to have employees answer before they come back to work. And they're not being shy about taking temperatures of employees, again, the ones that are being asked to return to work. Kirk, so, I just talked about making sure the people we're bringing back to work are healthy and safe for themselves and others. But what sort of ideas or plans do you recommend for employers now that these people are back to work? There's got to be some sensitivity on an ongoing basis. Do they remain safe? What are you seeing, or what are you advising employers about in that regard?
Yeah, I think it's much like you just talked about, Charlie. I think we're going to continue to take temperatures for a while, and we're going to continue to do that on a regular basis. We're going to continue to ask questions about travel and about exposure and about symptoms and about families. And for a while, I think the questionnaire is not only going to be an onboarding process, but it's going to be a continuing process. It's going to be a continuing dialogue with employees. And if people are and we were talking earlier about, every time somebody coughs, we think there's an issue, and rightly so. We're sensitive at this point. And so if people are demonstrating internally symptoms that we think are consistent with what we know, what Dr. Milford's talked about, we want to be able to ask questions of them to ensure, and we want to do that politely. We don't want it when we want to do it respectfully, certainly. But we've got to ask the question, because the bigger picture here is everybody else's health, not only just that employee. We're concerned about them, but we're also concerned about the contagion that he talked about and the aggressive nature of this virus. And so I just think the rules are different, and then I would also encourage employers to really think about a communication plan, to really think about, we need to be transparent and we need to be consistent in the way we talk to our people. We're going to tell them, what are we doing to make sure our workplace is safe? What are we doing to ensure that we're following the CDC guidelines? What are we doing to ensure that we're trying to make the workplace as safe as possible? And I think you can't over communicate that. And not only is it the right thing to do, but it's also great evidence of your commitment to provide a workplace free from known hazards, a workplace free from, making sure that we have a safe and healthy workplace, OSHA violations, etc. So I think the more we do that, the better we do that, I think the better off we will be.
Well, Kirk, one of the things I've noticed when I've talked to employers, kind of thinking through this process, human nature is, the further we get down the line, more and more employees are going to have more comfort to return to work.
Yep.
So your communication, that being out there, being transparent, here's what we're doing to make sure you're safe. Here's what we're doing to make sure you understand your coworkers are going to be safe, your family. That's incredibly important. But I'm anticipating, and when we deal with employers, we talk about this, I'm anticipating there's still going to be some employees who are going to be unwilling or hesitant to return to the workplace. What sort of guidance can you give us there?
Yeah, I mean, it's already happening, and we're seeing it routinely where clients of ours will call and they'll say the employee just is scared to return. They feel like they're at risk, or maybe they have a family member that's at risk, and so you really do have to do this on a one-on-one basis, and you really have to have a direct interaction, much like we talk about under the ADA, where we have this interactive communication, this interactive process whereby we communicate with the employee. We need to understand what's the nature of their situation. Is there a specific health issue that they have, or that they have a family member that has, about which they're concerned, or are they just scared? Are they just fearful about what's going on? And as we know, generalized fear is not covered under the Families First or any other particular law, but we still need to address it. We still need to make sure that we are addressing it. So if it's a specific issue, a health issue, then we've got Families First Virus Act, we've got the ADA, we've got FMLA that are still in play, and we've got to kind of navigate through those areas. And if we've got a generalized fear issue, then we've got PTO that might be available, or we could allow them to take a leave without pay, and there are other things. I think the goal, especially in this initial phase, is not to terminate people, is not to take adverse action against people so they can at least allege that it's all related to this COVID-19 stuff. And so I think you want to be clear about those. And then I think there are a ton of options out there, Charlie, like short-term arrangements where people might be able to work remotely, continue to telework for a period of time, or be able to work on a different shift or different schedule, maybe come in later. We have a client of ours that is a bank, and they have a lady that is generally fearful, and so they've allowed her to come in and work at night after everybody's gone. She'll come in and do her work and get her work done that she's required to do, but she won't do it when the other employees are there. So I just think you got to think, and then again, this is that communication piece, but you need to communicate with these people who are fearful what steps you are taking, and that they're not any more at risk working here than they are anywhere else. They're no more at risk here than going to Walmart or going to the grocery store or going to pick up the pharmacy. That we are doing everything we can within the law and following the guidance that their exposure and their risk is not substantially greater than it is anywhere else. And so, yeah, Brandon,
Kirk, just a question that I have. What do you do about employees who do not practice social distancing at work? I was just randomly thinking, should you have a process, or what are your thoughts on having a process where people can tell HR, hey, Kirk comes into my office and sits right next to me, and I don't feel comfortable confronting him, but I'm not. It's making me very uncomfortable. And how do you deal with that, Kirk?
I think it's a classic HR issue where they come and get confidential communication from somebody. They don't feel comfortable, whether it's a harassment issue or an inappropriate workplace issue, or they're showing me inappropriate images on my computer. It's the same issue, which is we've got an employee that's uncomfortable. We should go have conversations. We should investigate to make sure. And then we need to communicate what our commitment is to making sure that we are social distancing, that we are doing everything we can. And it's not reasonable for somebody to come in and at this point, come in and sit right next to you and look at your computer. We're just going to have some, and we're going to have some discipline, and we're going to have some discipline with those employees to ensure that they understand that this is a different world. Again, we don't shake hands like we used to. We don't hug people like we used to. It's just different today. And so we've got to have some discipline about that for sure.
I think hugs have been out for a few years, really. That's not a recent development in the workplace, I think.
Now, you may be right.
Okay. Now, back to a very serious issue, whether we like it or not.
Yep.
There are going to be instances where we have employees who have returned to work and test positive, or perhaps live with somebody who tests positive. We're going to have those mini surges that Dr. Milford talked about. So when we're talking to employers about how to come back to work, how to resume, you have to plan for that eventuality. The possibility that someone that has returned to work has tested positive. And this is where we really are advocating, again, pushing the envelope, but consistent with health concerns, consistent with CDC recommendations. To Kirk's point, not just for the situations where someone is concerned about another employee not following appropriate social distancing, we need to have a policy in place and communicate it to our employees that if they test positive or they find someone or know someone who tests positive in the workplace or in their family or with someone with whom they reside, we have to have a mechanism so they know, here's what we expect of you. We want this reported. Here's how you report that. We're going to treat that respectfully, but we're going to have to act on it. And we need your help. So employees need to know, who do I go to if that's an issue or concern about myself or others with whom I'm associated. I also think when you're an employer in that planning, the next step is please report it to your local health authority, your local health department. We're anticipating that the contact tracing, that's going to become more sophisticated, more common, more important as we go down this road. So for employers who return to work, if God forbid you do run into a situation where an employee tests positive, we want to do the responsible thing as an employer. We want to report this to the health department because they may want to attack this and follow up on this on a contact tracing or contact tracing of employees. This blends into what we talked about earlier. We don't have the luxury anymore, I don't think, of not telling people when other folks have tested positive. We're going to have to give that information to the health department. I think as a practical matter, when we're trying to figure out who an individual that is tested positive has come in contact with, we need to tell employees with whom he works or with whom are in close proximity, because I've already found instances in which when you do handle it respectfully and as confidential as possible, but we always learn new points of contact we didn't know otherwise. So again, I think that's important.
I also think, Charlie, that when you tell the employee that's tested positive, first of all, they've already told everybody. And in fact, my experience is they've texted all their coworkers anyway to let them know they're concerned about their coworkers' health. And so just advising them that we're going to tell them that we're going to go communicate with others. I've not had any single person say, no, I don't want you to tell other people because I don't want them to know that I've got this situation. They want people to know because they want them to go get tested or go quarantine to make sure that they're safe and it doesn't infect the rest of the workplace.
That's exactly the experience I've had. And again, I guess our message is it's a little bit different from before this pandemic, but we're not shy about getting that information out there, acting on it, getting it to health authorities, and doing our part to keep the rest of the workforce safe and our clients safe, our customers safe, our visitors safe. There's no question that the health directives and guidances and legal directives and guidances are changing, Brandon. I mean, weekly, if not daily. And we're continuing to work with employers and advise them how best to handle that, taking into account both health concerns and health issues and concerns, legal concerns as well.
Very interesting, guys. I enjoyed listening to both of you talk and Dr. Milford in the first part. One quite final question for me, maybe before we wrap up this part two. How do I get a lot on the benefits side, employers asking me, what are other people doing? Is there a mechanism for us to provide information to employers about what other employers are doing, or do you have any ideas about that? Because even this morning, a friend of mine who's a CEO of a company emailed and said, I want to know what other employers are doing. Are they going to open things back up if STIT goes forward with this May 1? And is there a resource or a way for us to help with that?
Well, I think one of the things I'm finding right now is, I'm sharing with employers what the trends are. We're dealing with so many different groups here, and we're learning along with the employers. So when I'm talking to an employer, particularly if I can point to a comparable situation, a comparable industry, I'm not naming that other employer, but I'm throwing out there, hey, here are some options. Here are some things that have worked for other employers that make sense, we think, from a legal and a practical standpoint. So, not to toot our horn too much, but we're a good resource. But I also think, Kirk, that some of the HR groups are valuable. What other resources do you tap in to answer Brandon's question?
Yeah, I think SHRM's an excellent resource, and Tara and Tulsa and the Oklahoma City chapter are excellent resources here. And I think there are great other chambers and those kinds of things are giving good information. I do think it's important that we're learning from other. We have colleagues that we work with as well, and we're learning from them, and they're learning from us. And so we're all in this together. We're all in this trying to help deal with this in a way that is best for our employees, best for our employers. And so I don't think there's not a it's not my issue, or we don't own it. We're just trying to be a part of the answering and helping with the process, and we're available to help.
And
sure.
That's exactly what I'm seeing is nobody's being proprietary about ideas. Nobody's holding this in, because I think we all collectively, the more we share, the more that we work together, the more we communicate, we all learn from one another. And I think we all benefit from that.
I would also say that the COVID-19 response page that we've developed is excellent. So it's no charge to anybody. They can get on there and they can go look for articles. They can watch older videos. But they're all, it's all been done in the last month.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really up to date stuff, and it's going to continue to come out. So that's a great resource for anybody. We'd love them to be a client of ours, but even if they're not and they want to get information, that's available to them. We want to help.
Yeah, another advantage of the videos, you'll get the before and after of my haircuts. So that's just another benefit.
I prefer the before.
Okay.
So we'll close on that note.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you.